welcome Tracy, who is researching this topic. She's a researcher in literature and culture, and she has a particular interest in lesbian literary history. Her current research is focused on cultural narratives of shame and pride in relation to lesbian sexuality. Welcome, Tracy.
First, a heartfelt thank you to Anna and Helen for staging this event. For hundreds of years, shame has acted as one of the most important powers in governing human sexuality, particularly homosexuality. And shame, with its attendant consequences of violent persecution, isolation, and alienation, was the mechanism by which homosexuality was socially regulated. However, since the 1960s, the nature of sexual shaming has changed. With the advent of second-wave feminism, the sexual revolution, the gay and lesbian rights movement, and social media. And these changes have affected men and women very differently. In addition to conventional forms of sexism and homophobia, younger women, and lesbians in particular, must contend with a culture that is saturated with extreme forms of misogynistic pornography that fetishizes and dehumanizes lesbians on an almost unimaginable scale. Lesbian sex is now obscenely visible, whilst lesbians are shamed as exclusionary, transphobic, and even bigoted. In Irreversible Damage, Abigail Schreier interviewed young women who are contemptuous and dismissive of lesbianism because of its associations with extreme, degrading porn. Quote, "More than one adolescent girl I interviewed told me that whereas trans is a high-status identity in school, lesbian is not. It is, in fact, openly derided as a lesser identity. Masculine girls who can't admit they're supposed to be boys. In her all-girls high school in Britain, in which many of the girls in her class identified as transgender, 16-year-old Riley told me that lesbian was a dirty word. In a very superficial way, it's just not very cool," she explained. "It's a porn category." We may understand the internalised homophobia of young lesbians to be a survival mechanism to a traumatically hostile environment, which is both fundamentally sexist and lesbophobic in character. The impulse of young lesbians to adopt a trans identity is an obvious reaction to the hypersexualisation and performative femininity of contemporary culture. In this confusing, toxic, shame-filled environment, some young women are not only rejecting lesbianism, but also womanhood. A trans identity offers these young women an emergency escape and a desire for sexlessness, rather than a fantasy of sexual dominance. Unsurprisingly, these young women idealise and want to identify with a group that they perceive to be least vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse. As Schreier puts it, the young women who are choosing to transition flee womanhood like a house on fire. Same-sex attracted women may be trying to escape the strangled confines of their sexed identity, but frequently the flight results in isolation, as there is no longer a lesbian community, a visible lesbian community with which to find affinity. In the heartbreaking memoir Page Boy, Ellen, now Elliot Page, recounts how, quote, "I had not stepped foot into a gay bar. I was not and never had been part of a queer community. How to access such a thing was not just a mystery, but an impossibility, the loss of which was sizable. Agony in isolation, the shame and pain that I thought was mine alone. My heart aches for my younger self." Growing up in some of the most liberal states in North America, Page was unable to connect with or even identify a visible lesbian community. Isolated from the collective, in December 2020, at the age of 33, Page announced that she was transgender. Page Boy is a deeply unsettling and distressing memoir. Shame literally seeps into every chapter, and yet it is barely scrutinised. Towards the end of the memoir, Page observes, "The world tells us that we aren't trans, but mentally ill, that I'm too ashamed to be a lesbian, that I mutilated my body, that I will always be a woman, comparing my body to Nazi experiments. It's not trans people who suffer from a sickness, but the society that fosters such hate." Page then reflects upon her new status as a trans man. "I don't want to disappear. I want to exist in my body with these new possibilities. But perhaps that is one of the main components of a life lost to a lack of representation. Options erased from the imagination." In the most literal sense, Page could not be what she could not see as a young woman. In Page Boy, shame is everywhere, yet nowhere. Shame seems to be the unacknowledged shadow of gender identity ideology. In her remarkable memoir, Detransition, Max Robinson states simply that "I both transitioned and detransitioned specifically because I am a lesbian." Informed by feminist theorists like Janice Raymond and Mary Daly, Robinson examines her earlier lesbian-hating values against what she calls, quote, "the coercive activation of shame in a woman who has been made vulnerable through an incredibly misogynistic society." Robinson explores the misogyny of mainstream American culture and the predatory sexual violence within the LGBTQ community itself, often committed by trans women against lesbians. Unfortunately, these issues are not new. For decades, lesbian theorists have grappled with the fundamentally sexist and hypersexualised nature of the gay movement. In the 1980s and 1990s, theorists like Denise Thompson, Liz Stanley, Marilyn Fry, Sheila Jeffreys and Janice Raymond wrote about the fundamentally different interests of gay men and lesbians and the creeping dominance of masculinity and male sexual entitlement within the movement. In Lesbian Heresy, for example, Jeffreys explains how lesbian feminism became subsumed by the hypermasculine, hypersexual, sadomasochistic character of queer theory and queer activism. Lesbians were marginalised within the gay movement by a process of sexual shaming. Any feminist criticism of the male sex right was deemed to be a rejection of gay pride and the rights of the gay population to sexual freedom. Lesbians who were ideologically and politically critical were positioned as the humorless, glamourless killjoys of sexual liberation. It was such a successful strategy that shaming or cancelling has become embedded within queer political praxis, resulting in the kind of exclusion and dissent that we see today. Shame drives cancel culture and purity spirals. To understand exactly how and when shame became a definitive form of queer activism, we need to go back over 20 years to 2002 and the Gay Shame Awards that took place in San Francisco. The ultimate purpose of the awards was to publicly reject the official gay narrative of self-affirmation or pride. The targets of the awards were the wealthy, corporate-sponsored leaders of the gay movement, the supposedly gay bourgeoisie. The awards were intended to highlight the growing numbers of people who felt alienated by gay pride and its civic respectability, and to shame leaders within the gay pride movement for striving towards assimilation. David Halperin explains the purpose of the gay shame movement in the following terms, quote, "Gay shame willingly embraces those queers whose identities or social markings make them feel out of place in gay pride's official ceremonies. People with the wrong bodies, sadomasochists, sex workers, drag queens, butch dykes, people of colour, boy lovers, bisexuals, immigrants, the poor, the disabled. In the context of gay pride celebrations, the presence of such marginal or overtly sexual populations can be a cause of shame. Gay shame festivals strive to capitalise on that dynamic and to reverse it. What made such shameful figures attractive to the queer movement was their refusal to abide by social norms. Yet none of the proponents of gay shame were seemingly capable of anticipating where this queer resistance to normalisation might lead. But they were to find out at a conference that took place at the very progressive University of Michigan in 2003. This freely accessible conference ran with the title of Gay Shame, and it was organised by David Halperin and Valerie Traub, both of whom had been closely following the influential work of Eve Sedgwick and Sylvan Tompkins. Sedgwick herself was not in attendance, but the conference was attended by some of the most influential queer theorists of the day, including Douglas Crimp, Michael Warner, Judith, now Jack Halberstam, and Gail Rubin. In a typically queer, postmodernist style, the organisers wanted to examine how shame could be used to not only unite the fractured queer community, but also how shame might be used to galvanise the community to political action. Romanticising otherness and oppression, these theorists wished to seize on the potential revolutionary power of the shamed queer outsider. But that's not what happened. After failing to set limitations about how shame could be discussed and deployed, the conference descended into chaos. The largely non-academic audience castigated the conference and the conference organisers for not including racial minorities, sex workers, local activists, bisexuals, and every other group not formally named. Halperin explains that each complainant then, quote, confessed in a personal narrative his or her own experience of shame, and finally attempted to reattach that shame to others. As the discourse of shame took on increasingly didactic and moralising dimensions, the analytical and critical reflection on shame that the conference intended to enable risked being brought to a halt by the tactical redeployment of shame itself. This is a clear example of standpoint epistemology, or of testimony, or lived experience, superseding argument and evidence within the academy. By tactically redeploying shame, the lesbians in attendance were aggressively silenced, and the claims of male minorities dominated. At this 2003 conference, socially progressive queer activists discovered the power of shame. Activists became aware of their ability to embarrass esteemed academics within the walls of their own institution using personal narratives of victimhood. In the 20 years since, it is not so much that the world has turned upside down, but that shame has come from the inside and is now out in the public sphere. We can see the effects of unleashed shame today with the most depraved forms of sexuality on full public display, especially at pride events. It seems that the gay shame of old has given way to a kind of queer shamelessness. Like a powerful acid, queer shamelessness has dissolved sexual boundaries to the point where depravity is normalised and safeguards have all but evaporated. But whereas shamelessness has dissolved sexual boundaries, shame has worked in the opposite direction for gender identity. Gender categories are rigidly and vociferously policed and reinforced by the new queer activists. Whereas in the past, lesbians would be shamed by a process of exclusion, now lesbians and gay men are shamed by the process of inclusion. The shaming mechanism may have shifted from sexuality to gender identity, but the intent of the heterosexual majority to control homosexuality and gender nonconformity remains the same. We need to acknowledge that some of the worst perpetrators of this tactical redeployment of shame have been other lesbians, women who would describe themselves as feminist. Lesbian leaders like Nancy Kelly, formerly of Stonewall, implied that the sexual boundaries of lesbians that necessarily exclude men are transphobic and, quote, analogous to issues like sexual racism. Anna Brown of Equality Australia has also recently shamed other lesbians for attempting to maintain and to uphold sexual boundaries. Brown described the recent application by the Lesbian Action Group for an exemption to hold a lesbian-only event at the Victoria Pride Centre as a sad stunt. Brown's comment is particularly insidious, I think, as she implies that older lesbians who know what their sexual boundaries are simply out of date, an embarrassing relic from a bygone era. This is an overt attempt to shame the lesbian community and to stimulate intergenerational conflict. It is also an attempt to try to hold lesbians responsible for their own exclusion. For Anna Brown, it's not that lesbians are being actively discriminated against by the heterosexual queer majority, it's that lesbians are inexplicably choosing exile. According to Brown and Kelly, lesbians who refuse the community of men shame ourselves. Younger lesbians now contend with traditional forms of shaming from the right side of politics, shaming from the progressive left side of politics, and internalised shame, driven by social media, pornography, and a culture of victimhood. So as women who love and support other women, what can we do to combat shame? The antidote to sexual shaming is events like this. It's community and collective action. Lesbians exist on our own terms, and we have much history and culture to share and to celebrate. We need to hold a clearly defined, safe space for lesbian community, but we also need to be a welcoming community that is accessible. Finally, we need to build back a visible intergenerational community. It cannot be left to each generation to face the latest manifestations of shame and coercion alone. We need to reinvigorate the lesbian imagination and show young women that it is possible to live a full and a rich lesbian life. We need to think beyond male definitions of pride and shame. The next generation is depending on us. Thank you.